Welcome to Innovations and Breakthroughs with your host, Rich Goldstein, talking about the evolutionary, the revolutionary, the inspiration and the perspiration, and those aha moments that change everything. And now, here's your host, Rich Goldstein.
Rich Goldstein here, host of the Innovations and Breakthroughs podcast, where I feature top leaders and the path they took to create change. Past guests include Joe Polish, Roland Frazier, and Joe DeSena. This episode is brought to you by my company, Goldstein Patent Law, where we help you to protect your ideas and products. We've advised and obtained patents for thousands of companies over the past 27 years. So if you're a company that has software, a product, or a design you want protected, go to goldsteinpatentlaw.com, where there are amazing free resources for learning about the patent process. And you could email my team at welcome@goldsteinpc.com to explore if it's a match to work together. You could also check out the book I wrote for the American Bar Association that explains in plain English how patents work. It's called the ABA Consumer Guide to Obtaining a Patent. I have with me here today Howard Tiersky. Howard is the author of the recent Wall Street Journal best-selling book, Winning Digital Customers, The Antidote to Relevance. The book is a reflection of what Howard does in his everyday life. He runs a 75-employee digital agency that helps executives at large brands to transform the customer experience so that they will win in today's digital world. Howard speaks for large organizations at major events, on numerous podcasts, and he even taught for a number of years at New York University. I'm very pleased to welcome here today Howard Tiersky. Welcome, Howard.
Hey, Rich. Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Yep, my pleasure. Let's talk a little bit about background and how you got to where you are today. So your background is in digital marketing. Of course, you got involved in digital marketing in the early days. So do you want to tell me a little bit about how you got started in this field?
Sure, happy to. Well, gosh, my background, it depends how far back you want to go. My original background actually was in theater. And I sort of was, my education was to become a theater director, and was very passionate about theater and was doing digital design work back in the 90s, to date myself here, while I was pursuing my career in the theater. And then as opportunities to do things like CD-ROMs and kiosks and other kind of pre-internet interactive experiences became lucrative and creatively interesting, I started to do a lot of that type of work over the more traditional theatrical productions I'd been doing. And I got on that train and just sort of have been riding it ever since, as it became, more and more interesting to do things on the internet, and then the capabilities of the internet for animation, video, interactivity, e-commerce, social media, and on. And sort of the last few decades has just been a whirlwind. And I've been doing that. I was fortunate enough to be at Ernst & Young Consulting around the time when the internet was sort of becoming commercialized. And so I got to participate in a lot of big companies' first forays into creating digital properties, and have been helping support digital transformation. Of course, haven't called it that the whole last couple decades, but really helping companies make the shift to take advantage of digital and increasingly to reinvent their companies around a digital experience, which is really what companies need to do today, at least most do, in order to be really successful with today's digital customer.
Absolutely. And that's fascinating, that journey you've been on from the very beginning of it. And I'm curious, if you could pinpoint or even recall noticing the transformation that took place from the internet being a technical endeavor. In other words, a place where it was kind of oriented around the technology, and it was oriented around just kind of what was available, people being able to click on links to bring them to a different property or search for things. And it was very much oriented around technology. And at some certain point, that began the shift toward the customer, toward the customer experience. Because it clearly wasn't like that. If you look at web pages going back into the 90s, there was very little attention given to the customer experience. So I'm just wondering if there are a particular point in time where you noticed the beginning of that type of transition, where people kind of woke up to the fact that it wasn't just technical people that were on the internet, it was everyday people, and perhaps there needed to be a different approach to reach them.
Mm. Yeah, I think that over the years, what happened, among other things, was the internet went from being a sort of an academic and government project to something that was commercialized. And so once you start to commercialize something and it stops being just kind of a curiosity or someone's hobby, but something that a business is relying on, all of a sudden people start to ask questions about, well, are we getting the maximum revenue that we could from this channel? Are we succeeding in achieving our business goals, or is anything holding us back? And the principles of product design that came out of non-digital products, the concepts of things like design thinking that said, how do you really create a fantastic, telephone or mouse, computer mouse, or, any object, pencil sharpener. There's a whole heritage of that. And what happened was people started applying those same types of the thinking, the same types of questions. Companies like Frog Design and IDEO, and of course, Apple, working with some of those companies, really inspired people, I think, to realize that the technology world could massively benefit from the thinking of what you could generally call the world of design. And of course, I was already working in that intersection because I was someone with sort of a design and creative background, but working in a space, obviously with technology being a key kind of a part of the paint that you create something with. So I think then what happened was that some people were able to demonstrate, and certainly Apple, you have to give them credit as being a thought leader and an inspiration to show that if you create technology-driven experiences that are easy to use, that are a pleasure to use, you will get more business. Then I think a lot of businesses said, well, we want some of that, and started applying some of these same design practices to say, how can we make a better shopping experience? How can we make a better banking experience? Although many didn't. You see many companies that were laggards for a long time. So it's certainly not something that caught on like wildfire. It was surprisingly slow for companies to catch on that it was really, really important to focus on customer experience. And even to this day, a big part of the education mission that I have in my life is to help executives at companies who think they're being bottom line oriented and who therefore are a little bit skeptical of investments in quote unquote customer experience, because after all, is that really going to have ROI if we just give the customer a better experience? And of course, the answer is most of the time, yes. And there's plenty of data and studies and research that show that, and ways of approaching it to apply money to customer experience to deliver better result. But there's still a lot of skepticism about it, amazingly. So we're not 100% there in terms of everyone being persuaded.
Yeah, got it. And in terms of creating that customer experience, though, and in terms of you were saying some of those companies did not succeed, but some of them did kind of crack the code and figure something out that helped them be successful. So, and I know this really relates to the whole field and your whole body of work of how you do this. But I guess just how do we even approach the subject of like, what is it that makes a brand succeed online? Like what have they figured out?
Well, we've tried to study that because, of course, it's our job. We get brought into brands to make them succeed. And so we've been asking ourselves that question for decades. And not just asking it like, what could it be? But asking the underlying question is, if we're not sure, how can we find out? How can we study and analyze and reverse engineer and look for trends and say, well, what is it? We live in a digital world of endless experimentation. So if we pay attention, we have the opportunity to look at what everybody's doing and say, as you said, some things have been successful, some things have not been successful. What are the patterns? And of course, there's much one could say about it. But if I were to give you like a concise answer, I would say I think there's three main things that the companies that are really successful at digital are doing. The first is that they focus on what a client of mine termed hyper convenience. And I've been using that term ever since because I think it's good. What articulates this idea that the easier you can make the experience, the less time it takes, the less mental effort that it takes, the easier it is to learn. That is a major factor in getting someone to use your experience, be willing to be less price sensitive, come back more often, all these types of things. And Uber was so simple that when we got Uber, we didn't have to think about how to use it. It's just so obvious and easy to use. And of course, that goes back to that same design heritage that says, how do I make something that's super easy to use? So I think that's one of the three things, just absolutely. And, now you see it. It's like, I forget, was it P.T. Barnum or somebody had that quote, no one ever went broke underestimating the intelligence.
Public.
Yeah. So I think the new one is, instead of the intelligence, it's the laziness, right? It's like no one ever went broke overestimating the laziness of the American public. And I don't mean that in a critical way, but I mean, every bit of effort you can take out is heading you in the right direction. And this is why Netflix, when an episode of Stranger Things ends, it goes, okay, I'm starting the next one in 5, 4, 3, because you shouldn't have to go through all the trouble of finding where you put the remote. I mean, it could be on the table or it could be on the sofa. And then you got to pick which button to push. It's way too much work. They're just going to move it forward. And of course, we see that in so many products. So I think that's the first thing. Mm-hmm. And then the second thing is proactive personalization, the opportunity to take what we know about the customer and use it to create a better experience. And that's everything from your Amazon recommendations to your Netflix recommendations to just something as simple as a store knowing all of your credit cards, knowing your preferences, having all of your saved addresses. I think that is the second key thing. At Domino's, if you want to order a pizza, you can just text them the pizza emoji, and they'll just pull up whatever your last order was, whatever last address you had it sent to, whatever credit card you used last time, and just confirm you want that again, right? So that's bringing together both hyper convenience and the idea of proactive personalization. I grew up in the 80s, and I remember every Thursday night we'd watch Cheers, and they'd sing that song, "Sometimes you want to go where everybody knows your name," right? Well, these days we want to go where everyone knows our name, our shoe size, our credit card, our address, what we bought last week, what we might want this week.
Password.
Right. Who wants to have to remember a password?
Our other fields auto-populated, right? That's kind of everybody knows your name. Everybody has all of your info, so you can just click purchase.
Yes, absolutely. And while, of course, there are privacy considerations, the more fundamental drive that people seem to have is, I just want to deal with somebody who knows and gets me well enough that I don't have to do much work. So that area of proactive personalization is the second key one. And the third is just a massive value shift. Look at everything Google gives you for free. Look at how you can go to Spotify and play just about any song you ever wanted. What does it cost? Like $11.99 a month or something like that, what you used to pay for one album. Right. So just the fundamental idea, Dropbox lets you store terabytes of information for, what do they charge? $12 a month. So just this idea that things are either free or such a good deal. And, in Uber, for example, is half the price of a taxi cab or car service in many areas, not everywhere. Amazon's often the lowest cost, so this opportunity to get more for less with less effort and energy in a way that's more personalized to you. I think you could look across any successful brand, digital or non, but that's succeeding in today's digital world. And there may be something else, but these are the three major themes.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that's amazing. I've never heard those three, that set of three distinctions before, in terms of the things that make digital brands successful. Now, what about what about brands that have been around for a very long time, like famous brands that go back decades, even centuries? How do they make the transition to the digital world?
Yeah. Well, that is pretty much the topic of my book, actually, the antidote to irrelevance, right? Because the risk is that they don't. And of course, we've seen many brands that have failed, and whether that's Sports Authority or Toys R Us, or, you can make a long list of brands that have, and that's been going on for a while. It's not new. I mean, we have seen, of course, with COVID, a number of new failures of brands, but look back to companies like Kodak, Western Union. I mean, we have so many great brands that have not been able to make the transition to be relevant in a digital world. So you asked how. Well, I actually, having said that fairly depressing statement that I just made, I'll say the other side of the coin, which is that the first is to know that it absolutely can be done. I sometimes feel that some people, executives, and I get to be in a lot of behind the closed door meetings, what people say when they're not speaking publicly about how they feel. And it's not uncommon for me to hear people at big companies thinking about, I'm going to be out of here in a year anyway. I mean, this company's never going to be able to compete. Let's just do the best we can in the short term, because I have no idea how we're going to make it in the long run. And that can be very senior people at some big companies. Obviously, I won't name which. So there can be a kind of a sense of discouragement that, the Googles and the Facebooks and the Amazons and the Ubers and the Airbnbs, they're going to sort of take over the world. But if you look at what's happening, and that would have been a more supportable argument 5 years ago, and certainly 10 years ago, when it seemed like all the digital riches were being grabbed by the companies that were the new pure play digital born companies. But that's not true today. And if you look at
Webvan.
Right. Yes. But obviously in Webvan, obviously it was unsuccessful.
Yeah.
But you could certainly highlight many companies. I mean, the amount of, we did a report once, this was a number of years ago, looking at media companies and the value, and this was years ago at that time, of 4 or 5 big digital media companies like, Google and Facebook, was so much more than if you could pick like the top 40 media companies that have been around, whether that's, Universal Studios and Paramount and NBC, you could add them all together and they weren't nearly the value of these companies that have been around less than 10 years. And it's easy to get a little demoralized by that. But if you look at many of the companies, I mean, the number 2 most successful e-commerce retailer in the United States is Walmart. Number 4 is Costco. So yeah, Amazon's number 1. But absolutely, a Federal Express is killing it. The New York Times subscriptions have never been higher. So Starbucks is doing amazing things in terms of appealing to today's digital customer. And one could go on. And there's no question that these are the exceptions today rather than the rule. And there are many great legacy brands, like you mentioned, that are still struggling to make the transition. But I think the first thing they need to do is recognize that there's no excuse to say, oh, well, we're not a digitally first company. We're not Facebook. We're not Amazon. We're never going to be able to make this work. And I think you need to have the mindset of the scale of the transformation that's probably necessary. Netflix, sometimes I hear people say, well, those companies that are successful, those are all just technology companies. They're all tech companies, Netflix and Uber. And they're not tech companies. Oracle is a tech company. I grant you that, right? They make software, right? Yeah. Apple is a tech company. Of course, now they're increasingly also becoming a media company. But Netflix is a media company.
Right.
Uber is a transportation company. Say again?
Netflix was a mail order company. They made their business through just a large scale, like being able to mail DVDs, at scale. That's really what their business was built on, not even the technology.
Right. So sometimes we think they're all tech companies because they're so tech centric.
Yeah.
But they're really in another industry. And that means we need to think about every company that, that's what it looks like when a media company is digitally transformed. And that's the scale of change and the scale of transformation that some companies need. And then sometimes people look at that scale and they go, to get from here to there, how would I get there? Right? No one's career is long. How would we make that transformation? But it absolutely can be done. And then my book, which I won't try to go into all the details here, but is a 5-step process for how can a company go through the 5 major steps that I outlined through the book of taking large brands. In my experience, I'm being told that people are applying the principles of my book for a lot of small, medium-sized businesses, which I love to hear. But my experience and the thing that I focus on in my career and what I wrote my book with in mind are big companies and how big companies, because that's what I know. And so this is a 5-step process for any significantly sized brand or company to make the journey from where they are to where they need to be.
Yeah. Well, that's great. And so in terms of the book, like, what was that project like? How long of a project? How long you've been working on it? Kind of, and how did it come together? And how did you organize it? Tell me a little bit about a little bit of insight into that. Because I think a good part of my audience is very interested in how you take something from in here and you bring it out into the world, which is what you do professionally, is you help people to take concepts and turn them into real life action. But the book itself, that creative venture, I'm very curious about. Tell me.
Yeah. Well, I'll start by saying when I write another book, I will follow a very different process than I followed in writing this book. I definitely learned a lot. This is actually my second book. But the first book I came out with was a much smaller, less ambitious book. And I'm not really sure how to say when I started it, because what I really did was, for years, I've been writing articles and videos and other things on discrete topics related to digital transformation, ideation, design thinking, user experience, many of these types of topics. So I have hundreds and hundreds of articles out there. And so at a certain point, when I decided I wanted to do a book, I had this idea. I think somebody had convinced me. They said, Howard, just take all these articles you've written. You've got a book here. All you have to do is kind of curate them and organize them.
Right.
And you have a book. And so I said, okay, great. And actually,
all you have to do is
yeah. Well, easy for the person who's not going to do it to say, right? So I actually had one of someone who works on my team, Connor, who's really great. And I said, here, you're going to help me with this project because my time is constrained. And I said, we're going to take all these articles and we're going to figure out it. Anyway, we took all these articles and we tried to sort of shape them into a book. And it wasn't super successful in terms of like being a cohesive book, It was a whole bunch of articles all put in one big Microsoft Word file. And then I'm like, okay, can we just sort of figure out how to like bring in one article, I would say these 5 things. And in the next article, I'd say 6 other things. And 2 of the things were the same things I'd said in the prior article, but some of them were different. Anyway, bottom line is at a certain point, we had this thing that had a lot of great content, but it didn't have great structure and it wasn't really readable end to end. And it wasn't really a cogent single thing. And I heard
the way you wanted to.
Yeah. So I'm like, oh, this isn't really like quite where I was trying to go. Like, who was it again that told me I could just take all my articles and put them into a book? And to be perfectly blunt, it probably depends how good a book you want and what you want the book to do. Of course, if you can put a cover on something and say, here's 25 articles, and just call it a book. But I wanted something that people could use as a real guidebook to being able to drive transformation. And I realized at that point that I had all the answers were there, but the structure was not there just by putting articles together. So I actually hired an outside development editor instead of someone from my team that I said, you're going to help me. I hired somebody who had edited tons and tons of books. And I said, take a look at this thing we've got, which by the way was like 600 pages, right? And I'm like, it's too long. It's hard to read. Anyway, so she was super helpful. Marilyn Friedman was her name. And she helped us take all of that content and figure out what was the framework that was behind all of it. And then, to be honest, I just really wound up rewriting the whole thing from scratch. I used all that stuff more like for reference. And I'm sure there's places where there's a paragraph from an article here or there, but in reality, it didn't really work to try to turn all these articles, other than just in terms of the ideas that were in the articles, which certainly many of which wound up in the book, but the actual what was written, largely not. And so, and that's why I say I wasted a lot of time. I would do it. It would have been easier to just start from scratch than to try to start from all my old articles, to be frank. But anyway, the whole project was probably a couple of years. And if I had done it in a more, a different way, I probably could have done it in 6 months or 9 months instead of 2 years. But that's a version of the story anyway.
That's fascinating. Thanks for sharing that. And
sure.
And so the title of the book, winning digital customers, that's actually branding that you carry out through a lot of other mediums where you look to educate people about how to do this, how to do this type of branding transformation. So you also have a live cast on LinkedIn by the name Winning Digital Customers, and you also have a podcast, Winning Digital Customers, correct?
That's all true. Yes.
Yeah. And so that's been core. I guess that's core branding for you. That in terms of now your brand, then just zooming out and looking at your brand, that helps people have a consistent experience with the type of info that you provide.
Yeah, I hope so. That's the goal, to make it easy for people to recognize this is all coming from kind of the same voice, the same message. And I always like brands, and this is what I try to do with that brand, that just put it out there. What are they actually delivering to you? I know people only are interested in the things I talk about, like digital transformation. Like you'll notice the words digital transformation aren't even the title of my book. At one point they were, like with many books, we went through many different titles. But in the end, I feel like people care less about how. Well, first people really have to get engaged with what's the result you're offering them. And only once they get excited that you have a result that they want, then they want to know, okay, well, what's the how? How do I get the result? And of course, the answer is digital transformation, design thinking, agile. I mean, there's a lot of practices we talk about in the book. Anyway, so we wound up just branding it. What is it people really want? And what is it that they don't want? I always feel like as a marketer, which is part of what I do is marketing, I feel like, and so I tried it in as few words as possible, because obviously the title of a book can only be so long. You give people what I think they want to win and win digital with today's digital customers, and remind them of what they don't want and the risk, which is, what's the antidote to irrelevance. So I hope that word irrelevance, I don't ever want to get people down. I'm a positive person, but I do really think that companies have a real risk. We see it around us all the time. The field is littered with bodies. So let's not kid ourselves. It's put up or shut up time for big companies in terms of demonstrating that they can really be elegant in a digital world.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess the interesting thing about that choice of words, irrelevance, too, is it's like what you want is people to love your brand. But if they don't love your brand, they don't hate your brand. You're just irrelevant.
Yeah, I think that in the book we talk about that idea of love and how that's probably the most valuable business asset there is when people really love your brand. And of course, we all know brands. We all have brands in our lives that we love. And as you say, we have many brands that we do business with, but we don't love because, you got to get gas somewhere. Maybe you don't love your gas station. But the problem is then it's a race to compete on price or location or, and it's so easy for someone to take your customer. But when you have a customer that was really emotionally connected to your brand, then you have an asset that transcends some new competitive shiny object, somebody's sale price, all those kinds of things.
Great. That's amazing. Amazing advice. And if people want to learn more about you or get in touch with you, how do they go about doing so?
Yeah, well, I would love them to go to winningdigitalcustomers.com, winningdigitalcustomers.com, all one word, obviously. And there you can actually download the first chapter of my book for free if you like. And you can, of course, find my podcast wherever you get your podcasts, Apple, Spotify, et cetera.
Streamed.
Yes, exactly. And the live cast is on LinkedIn, Facebook, and YouTube. So again, if you search for my name, Howard Tiersky, or Winning Digital Customers, you should find it. We do live casts on Mondays and Wednesdays, and we drop one new podcast every week where I'm interviewing a leader in the world of digital transformation.
Fantastic. So the book again is Winning Digital Customers, The Antidote to Irrelevance. Howard Tiersky, I really appreciate you being here. This was a fantastic conversation. So thanks so much.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for listening to Innovations and Breakthroughs with your host, Rich Goldstein. Be sure to click subscribe, check us out on the web at innovationsandbreakthroughs.com, and we'll see you next time.